Hi there, this is Matt with State of Flux here with a review for Star Trek Enterprise, continuing my journey through the Trek franchise. Now, when I last left you, it was with a review for Star Trek First Contact, and at the end of that I said that I was going to move on rather than to the Next Generation sequel movies, that I would revisit those a little later down the line, but rather because First Contact ends with Zefram Cochrane in the past and Enterprise picks up about 100 years after the end of First Contact, the most logical point after watching First Contact is to continue on with Enterprise. So those next-gen sequel movies will come down the line. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about Star Trek Enterprise. This is the sort of much maligned series of the original 5 or 6, depending on if you include the animated series in the bunch. And I get it, partially, especially upon this rewatch with analytical eyes. I get why you can come at this one harder than most of the others. But I don't think it's nearly as bad as people will have you believe. I think its biggest downfall, and as I say, I am kind of a defender of Enterprise. I do like it at the end of the day. The biggest downfall is the hubris by the creators. And Berman and Braga, who had done great things to elevate Next Generation and sort of guide, in parts, Deep Space Nine, but particularly Voyager, and developing these series, they thought that they could do Star Trek better. And I'm not talking about as a franchise, I'm talking about the original series. And the biggest problem with Enterprise is its hubris that it's another go at the original series to tie it more firmly into the continuity of the existing 3 franchise shows that they had created. If you look at it, you have basically the same character dynamics. You have a Vulcan, they just gender swapped her, who has beef kind of constantly with a dude from the South who has no problem spouting off his beliefs very passionately with Trip. And this is very reflective of the Spock-McCoy relationship and how these two voices sort of lend balance to Archer. Tpol is very much Spock, as I say, just with a gender flip, and Trip is very much Bones. Archer is kind of the flat piece here, that he's nowhere near as interesting or dynamic as Shatner is, but I think especially at that time, Shatner's performance in the original series was viewed almost purely as camp, I think, by these creators. So Archer was their stab at legitimizing what Shatner didn't in the original series. Now, Shatner's performance in the movies is not in question. I think this is sort of a revisionist's journey through the original series and setting up a firm continuity that connects to Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. Deep Space Nine isn't really included in this almost at all. There is like hints at Voyager stuff and certainly a lot of Next Gen stuff and re-attempts at stories brought into the original series. So, with that in mind, Season 1 feels pretty bland. Like, it's not a bad series, and there's certainly good episodes. I think Strange New World is a fantastic episode. You had Shuttle Pod 1. It concludes with 2 Days and 2 Nights, I want to say the episode's name is. That's the penultimate episode of the season. That one's fun, and the characters work, but the characters are just riffs on other characters pre-existing. I think Sato is an interesting character. They don't really use her to her full extent. Mayweather is almost completely forgotten and is just kind of there as needed, which is so weird because his presence in the first episode is one of the strongest elements of that first episode. But I digress. They didn't really do much with his character pretty much throughout the series. That's kind of a constant state of criticism. Malcolm, they seemed really, really interested in, and I understand why, given the context of history. They introduced him as sort of like the Worf-like character in the sense that he was very militaristic and all about security and stuff like that, but he was a human, and it's probably trying to draw parallels to humans being that barbaric long ago, where now in the future the Klingons are the barbaric ones. That said, this first season debuted shortly after 9/11, or maybe just before 9/11, and that reshaped how his character got utilized. And his character, which I think was supposed to be sort of a criticism of barbaric nature of man, kind of got altered into his character being elevated much more prominently than he probably was originally designed to be, and particularly in the last couple seasons, reflective of our wartime that we had entered into. I mentioned Mayweather, I mentioned Sato. Phlox is the sort of one unique character that I think really works. He does kind of feel a touch like the Doctor in Voyager, just a hint, but I liked his element in this. Tpol isn't the only alien on board. You have Phlox, and while everybody's standoffish with Tpol, everybody's completely accepting of Phlox, and he's one of the best components of the whole series, and I like him. However, a lot of these characters just seem like re-attempts at particularly original series characters. Mayweather very much is just kind of Sulu again. Sato is just kind of Uhura. They give her a little more to do, particularly in like season 4 and some parts of season 3 and stuff, but those characters that were underused in the original series, still kind of underused here. But yeah, I digress. Season 1 is fine. It's not bad, but coming off of like an interesting crew with Voyager. Voyager, I would argue, at least as of now, is my least favorite of the original 6 series. However, I really liked the crew community on board that. I think this lands the stories a little better because the character dynamics are stronger and more tied to traditional Star Trek because they're essentially just that. But coming off of Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Next Generation, you can kind of look at this show and see how it might be the weakest one because it's also the stuff you've seen the most of. And they're exploring new territory by giving you origin stories to things that you're familiar with, like how we get up to Warp 3 and all that kind of stuff. Like, that's interesting, I guess, but it's like, did we need that? I don't know. It suffers from, like, the prequelitis. Season 2 takes a little more chances with its story and feels a little more traditionally Star Trek, but also not breaking any new ground. And if season 2 had continued its track into season 3, I think this show would have died messily. Now, season 2 has some great episodes, in fact some of the best episodes of the series. You have Carbon Creek, you have Dead Stop, which I really like. That feels a very next-gen episode, or even like original series. You have First Flight, which is kind of an emotional journey of how Archer got to captain the Enterprise. You have, oh gall, I can't think of the name of the episode, but it's a good one. I wrote it down, hang tight. Future Tense. Future Tense is really neat, sort of whisked into the future. You have Regeneration, which is the most direct tie to the Next Generation series. This is the first confrontation with the Borg. That episode is really fun adventure, and because they are so far in the past, you're like, how do they get out of this? And I like how that connects to Zefram Cochrane, and that his whole story continues into this without his presence being there, but public perception of him, and seeing how he was, how history loses the truth of the man to heroification, and that element of first contact gets kind of brought on board a little bit in Regeneration. But the problem with all these episodes is, despite some of these great one-offs, some of which I will talk in further detail of my feelings of them in my top 10 countdown coming next week. And that's why I kind of just skirted past like Carbon Creek and things. Despite these great one-off episodes, the one-off storytelling by this point had been kind of done pat, and television had evolved beyond that through TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Sopranos. The Wire was coming out around this time. These shows were gaining in popularity with a continued linear storytelling, not Creature of the Week, which Star Trek had kind of been. Now, Deep Space Nine gave you long-form series, but or season arcs and stuff like that, but largely the other shows didn't. Voyager gave you a trajectory of where the show needs to go by the end of it, but I wouldn't say that it was narrative storytelling that we see in current television. The final episode of Season 2 did a couple of things. It reframed itself. It itself is another pilot to the show, saying we recognize that the show is stale and that you want something different, or audiences are expecting something different. So the final episode of Season 2, The Expanse, acts as a second pilot to the TV show, Enterprise. And this is where the show Enterprise changes its name to Star Trek Enterprise. Star Trek had been left largely off. You were meant to just understand that it was a Star Trek property. Season 3 onwards ties directly Star Trek into the title, to the experience. Season 2 ends with a terroristic attack that affects the whole of the United States and the world at large, because we got attacked by the Xindi, manipulated by an alien species that kind of comes and goes throughout the story and is the kind of entire motivation of Season 1's story arc that gets lost in the shuffle by the time we hit Season 4. They're aliens from 1,000 years in the future that are trying to alter the past, kind of John Connor style, Terminator, Skynet, all that stuff. They're trying to do that to Archer's story so that the first flight never really takes off. That's kind of the bare backbone. It doesn't really play largely into the show in any meaningful way by the end of it. That's why I'm not going to cover it. But they manipulate the Xindi into doing a terroristic attack on Florida, which has direct ties to some of the characters and is a direct reflection of the 9/11 attacks and how we kind of weaponized ourselves into going in for an attack. And Season 3 tells one season-long story of our war with the Xindi. And it touches on elements of xenophobia and stuff like that that were prevalent after 9/11, but it's not critical enough of it. And I think that's because Braga, particularly from my understanding, has sort of firm conservative values, and I think he was working that out through this show with his response to 9/11. Now, Season 3, I think, is a good season. It's probably the best individual season of Enterprise. It's telling one long story. However, it's the unevenness in writing is still there, and the best episodes of the season, rather than being story arc episodes, are still the unique for want of a better term, bottle episodes. I know that's not a traditional bottle episode, but the one-off episodes that you get, such as Twilight and Similitude and E2, all of these just are sort of one-off episodes that tease the exact same thing of like what happens to these characters in the future, or what happens when we see a lifetime in a day. All three of those episodes kind of deal with some variant on that idea, and they're great episodes. Like, if I were to get people to watch any kind of Star Trek, I would show them any of those three episodes, and I think they would get a firm understanding of what this show is, who these characters are. It's good storytelling, and it's good writing. Then you have sort of the conclusion of the third season. Let me just figure that out. Countdown is the second to last episode. Countdown is a really good rev 'em up, big action kind of set piece that is season 3 in a nutshell. If you want to watch season 3 in just an episode, watch Countdown. It's the second to last episode of the season, but you can see how it's being not only reflective of the wartime that we're presented with in our daily lives, if you grew up watching this show in real time as I did, it also becomes reflective of the other media that is doing well and much more popular than Star Trek. When during Enterprise's series run, you had a Star Trek movie that even came out and completely flopped by Star Trek movie standards. And that's because a couple other big franchises came out and started stealing the show. Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. But it was the rebirth of Star Wars that I think had the furthest influence into season 3. So much so, there's like a council of villain aliens that are working against what would be the Federation, Starfleet, whatever. And they look like the alien like council from Attack of the Clones, which would have come out just like a year or two prior to season 3. And you revisit this council of villains a couple of times. And it's also not lost on me that the Xindi alien design, they're these kind of reptilian aliens and stuff like that, which has a fantastic look, kind of lifted directly from Galaxy Quest, which was its own riff on Star Trek. And so while season 3 is probably the best individual season of the show, it's also the season that just kind of makes you point to other prominent pieces of media around that time that are kind of sometimes better, and think like, we're not watching Enterprise because we want to watch those other things. We have those other things. We're watching Enterprise because we want more Star Trek, and this season strays furthest away from it. However, it is a pretty good storyline. It's interesting and compelling. It just doesn't feel Star Trek at all. The whole military versus one unified force of terror doesn't really translate well to Star Trek. And that's kind of its own problem. And I think they sensed it too, because when they transition into season 4, you have like the pilot of season 4 that kind of wraps up and ties up all the loose ends of season 3. And then you have a pretty strong episode, which I think comes third of the season, called Home, where the Enterprise returns home for the first time. And we see these people at home. And it's similar to the episode Family from Next Generation, where the crew's just gone through something tremendous in both good and bad ways. And you see how each of the characters kind of deals with it. And Home is a very good episode, and I think that was the pledge to the audience of, we recognize what we just did strayed far from what we pledged to do initially. So this is the second pledge, a third pilot, if you will, that what's coming next is going to be very Star Trek. And I think largely succeeds. Season 3 probably should have been the series end. Season 4 came on because I think the studio wanted to give them a final season to end things on. And I also think that the creators recognized that the idea of the next generation crew, their movie time was kind of done, and Enterprise is flailing. There is probably not a chance to bring this crew into the movies. So season 4 is its attempt at what those stories would have been had the Enterprise crew gotten their own movies. Because most of season 4 is in 2 to 3 episode arcs that act as feature-length films. You have the Augment trilogy, starting with Borderland, Cold Station 13, which I think is the best episode of season 4, and then you have the Augments. That tells a proto-Khan storyline that ties it also directly into Data's storyline, of all things, including a reprisal of Dr. Soong by Brent Spinner, which is really done well. I think a couple of those episodes, or at least one of those episodes, is directed by LeVar Burton. They're really trying to remind people that this is Star Trek by this point. You have a couple episodes in between before you dip into the Affliction storyline, which talks about how the Klingons lose the ridges in their head by manipulating and what do you do, cloning or whatever? Playing with the hooky science to take the Augment's DNA to make perfect Klingons. However, they become afflicted with this Klingon disease, and they need Dr. Phlox to try and cure it. But they lose the facial ridging. This is how they explain why the Klingons will look different in the original series. And this series also stops trying to become the original series, but then transitions into connecting to the original series. You've gotten hints of that here and there, but this is really where it comes into full blossom. A couple episodes later, you have the In a Mirror Darkly. You are taken into the dark universe of Star Trek, the Mirror Universe, and see some of the origins of that. And that one ties directly into the episode The Tholian Web from the original series. And that was really cool, and it was fun seeing this crew in the attire of the original series, and that was really, really fun. And then you have the series finale episodes called Demons and Terra Prime that kind of act as the series finale of the show. I'll talk about the last episode in a minute, but because I think it has more merit than a lot of people give credit for, with a big-ass asterisk. But all this to say is, like, for those series of movies, like, this acts as, like, movies for the Enterprise crew, and largely it works. You get some really good, interesting, creative character beat stuff, particularly with Trip and Tpol, who I think are the two best written characters on the show, utilized the best. Trip is, the actor playing Trip is easily the best actor of the bunch, and it shows. Scott Bakula, I think, works well enough. They tried to do a sort of proto Picard and then just pair him with the Kirk crew, and it doesn't really work. You lose that dynamic energy. Scott Bakula is fine, but he's never great. Which is a shame, because he actually is a very fine actor. He just doesn't really get a chance to stand out as Shatner did, or Kate Mulgrew, or certainly Patrick Stewart. DS9 has its own energy and whatnot, so I'll cover that one at a different point in time. Focus on the Enterprise stuff before I get into the spin-off stuff. But he just sort of has that lacking quality, and I think that is really what kind of hurts the show to some extent. I guess it's time to talk about the last episode, eh? These Are the Voyages is the final episode of Star Trek Enterprise, and it makes perfect sense as a final episode of Star Trek Enterprise because it doesn't at all, does it? It seems weird and jarring that suddenly this becomes an episode of The Next Generation, but when you're looking at it from a specific lens, it makes sense. The series finale to Star Trek Enterprise is truthfully Demons and Terra Prime. That is the episode that you kind of wrap up the budding romance between Trip and Tpol. It's where Jonathan Archer actualizes his importance in the future of Star Trek and the importance to how he will impact characters later on. These Are the Voyagers isn't a season finale or a series finale to Star Trek Enterprise at all. It is a goodbye epilogue from Brannon Braga and the other guy that I can't remember his name right now. But I said it earlier, and you can just go back and I'll write it down below. But this is the Next Generation creative team saying goodbye to everything that they've accomplished between Next Generation and Enterprise. And they flip back and forth between the two. Now, half of the story is done exceptionally well, and I like, and the other half isn't done quite as successfully. But it does have my favorite character from Star Trek Next Generation. So, I will touch more on These Are the Voyages when I talk about my top 10 list for Star Trek Enterprise. That said, These Are the Voyages, I get why you would be upset. You've invested 4 years, nearly 100 episodes with this crew, to have it be a final episode whose main character arc is for a character who isn't even on the show. It's for William Riker, and how that storyline actually plays out in an episode from the final season of The Next Generation. So his character arc is already an arc that we knew he committed. Like, we didn't need to see this arc at all, which I think is emblematic of the problem with prequels. The very nature of prequels is you know the outcome of these stories. You know where they're going to go. Sure, you can create connective tissue that is important, that maybe have lasting legacies within the franchise that you're tackling or prequeling, but largely they are unnecessary bits of information to fill in gaps. The most egregious of which would be like how Wolverine gets his jacket, or how Indiana Jones gets the cut on his lip and his hat and his whip. It makes for interesting beats of information, but it's also unnecessary. Did we need to know how Han Solo got his gun? Does it make it any more interesting watching A New Hope, knowing how he gets his gun? No. And I think largely Enterprise suffers from this. Now, there are exceptions. I did find the episode of how warp drive was really kind of utilized for the first time successfully. That was neat, and going back and touching on that was fine. But largely, I think you get into territory where it muddles up existing storylines and canon. And I think that, like, I recommend watching Affliction and Divergence. However, that muddies up the relationship with the Klingons. Sure, you've explained why their foreheads are flat, and how people unfortunately look like they're in brownface in the original series. But it also kind of is weird that they were on seeming good terms with the Klingons for Enterprise. Oftentimes when they show up, like, they're kind of the bad guys, but they're never nearly as arch as they were in the original series, or honestly in good chunks of the Next Generation. It muddies the information that you already have. So, as we say goodbye to Star Trek Enterprise, I kind of end with, it's an unnecessary journey to take, spent with some pretty interesting characters that I like, that are themselves rehashes of characters that I previously liked before, but, you know, done with modern special effects. And I would say that the special effects in this show largely hold up pretty fantastically. Maybe not the Gorn in A Mirror Darkly, but largely I think the special effects, particularly of that ship, which is a good-looking ship, and you can see how that would turn into the Enterprise, which would turn into the Enterprise D that we have become familiar with in the shows leading up to this. But yes, there you have it. It's not a bad show, kind of an unnecessary show, especially since it's largely never been touched on again afterwards. But there you have it. What do you think of Star Trek Enterprise? I give it 3 stars. It's worth watching. I don't like it nearly as much as I did back in the day. I think it has glaring problems of the era, but also helped to contextualize that era from a perspective now that I didn't necessarily have back when I was watching it. This is absolutely reflective of the Iraq War and the terroristic attacks that Osama bin Laden had executed on American soil, and told from an incredibly American perspective that is oddly unbalanced even for Star Trek. And also the switch up in network played a big part. The sexualization of women, which has always been kind of egregious in most of Star Trek, is ramped up here to like 11, and it tones down by the final couple episodes of the series, but women are not painted particularly well. They're painted with large brushes of lust, and that's unfortunate and dated, but also reflective of the time. I urge you to watch other media of the early 2000s, and like, you have to remember, this is when Fast and Furious was coming out, and look at how the women are treated in that. It's pretty similar to how they are treated in this, and the whole UPN vibe. But there is still that inescapable element of Star Trek that I like about the show. I had a few last thoughts. I was ready to post this video a day or two ago, but then I really got to thinking that I missed a couple key things. One thing I wanted to address is I misspoke in the review that you heard earlier. I mentioned the conservatism of Brannon Braga, but it was actually Berman, so I misspoke. His conservatism clearly fueled parts of the story in seasons 3 especially, but throughout the entire series run. So I apologize for that misspeak. And thanks for bearing with me on this already overlong episode. A couple last things that I wanted to address. I failed to mention the look of the show. I mentioned the special effects and how good those looked, but I never really addressed the interior of the bridge or the costumes. What I liked about this is everything had this kind of cold steel look to it, and the uniforms that the characters wore were much more evocative of present-day NASA. And I thought that really worked to help as connective tissue from what we're most familiar with, then moving into what we would get with the original series in TNG and stuff like that, where the bridge itself has like this cold metallic feel about it that feels very much like we're familiar with from space stations and space explorations as we've been privy to, grounding it in an earthly level before moving on to the exoticism of Kirk's Enterprise and its mood lighting, as well as the Next Generation with its almost seafaring quality to its cruise ship of a bridge. So I really liked that aspect of Enterprise. Last thing that I wanted to talk about is the theme song. And I'm sure a lot of you were waiting for me to address it. I'd planned to address it earlier in the review, but I wanted to end with a story about it. Because my relationship with the theme song for Enterprise is kind of an unusual one. I, like many people, were like, what the F is this? When I first heard it, I was like, a ballad? Really? Like, why is this happening in my Star Trek? And after watching through the 4 seasons, especially around season 3 when they switch up the theme song and give it a little more up-tempo and a like peppier, rockier beat, it grew on me and whatnot. This immediate watch through that I did right now made me fall in love with that song and love the theme to Enterprise, because I would watch this in the morning, and every morning my daughter, who's not even 2 yet, would be like, Trek? And I'd be like, yep. And then when it got to the theme song, she would be like, dance? And then she and I would like dance to that song. And so it warms my heart, and it'll be a forever memory established because of this show and that song, which she absolutely loves. So my relationship with the Enterprise theme was similar to most people's, of the like why, and has moved into a firm fondness and love. Speaking to the opening credits themselves, I think that's the best opening credits of any Star Trek show. Watching the progression of space travel and incorporating the shot from First Contact is all great. I like that stuff. But this is where we say goodbye to the TNG era of Star Trek. And it was a good ride. It had its ups and downs, and it didn't necessarily stick the landing, especially with that final episode. But what it did do was keep Star Trek a thought-provoking intellectual property that really focused on that intellectual aspect. It gave you teleplays that were always trying to get you to think or examine morality or ethics and things like that. And I appreciate that. And we're moving into an era of Star Trek coming forward with the next couple of reviews that I'm going to be doing, examining the J.J. Star Trek movies, the Kelvin era as it's been called. And the biggest thing that it loses is its intellectualism. That's not necessarily to speak to the quality of the films, but it does have a marked downward trajectory for Star Trek as a thought-provoking entity. But I am excited to talk to you about the JJ Treks, so stick with me for those reviews in the next couple of weeks. This coming week you will get my top 10 episodes of Star Trek Enterprise. So yeah, set your phasers to stun that like button, subscribe, share, do all that good stuff, and thanks for staying with me on this overlong episode.